Good afternoon. Welcome to Capital Account. I'm Lauren Lister here in Washington, D.C. These are your headlines for Wednesday, October 24th, 2012. The Federal Open Market Committee released a statement following its two-day meeting announcing nothing new, really. It's maintaining its existing programs of QE3 and Operation Twist, keeping interest rates in a coma until at least mid-2015. It's a statement, though, that you will never see on a Fed press release, that the U.S. is trying to inflate its way out of debt while perpetuating the U.S.'s fiscal imbalances? That's the question we have. We'll discuss. Plus, the third-party presidential debate was last night, bringing up fiscal policy and economic, national security arguments missing from the mainstream. Here's one.
The biggest threat to our national security is the fact that we're bankrupt.
How about that? Karl Denninger and Mike Norman are here to talk about what should or should not be done by the technocrats or elected leaders when it comes to helping the country out of economic doldrums. And Goldman Sachs versus Goldman Sucks. The op-ed writing Goldman defector Greg Smith is out with his new book. He and Lloyd Blankfein have been hitting the airwaves today. We'll talk about the highlights. Let's get to today's Capital Account. So last night were the U.S. presidential debates you did not see on network TV. It was the third-party presidential debates with candidates from the Green, Justice, Constitution, and Libertarian parties. And on this stage were issues that we have not heard about in the mainstream duels between Romney and Obama. This includes money in politics, cutting defense spending dramatically, monetary collapse, and the government's role in the student loan debt crisis. So let's bring in our guests and use some of these economic and fiscal arguments to fuel ours. Here to talk about all of this is Mike Norman, chief economist of John Thomas Financial, and author and trader Karl Denninger. So gentlemen, first, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So let's just start. I want to throw out a soundbite from Gary Johnson just to play a little bit of what was discussed in terms of federal spending and monetary collapse. Let's take a listen.
I promise to submit a balanced budget to Congress in the year 2013. That is a $1.4 trillion reduction in federal spending. If we don't do this now, we are going to find ourselves in a monetary collapse.
Okay, so not focusing on Gary Johnson as a candidate or a politician, but this issue of a significant reduction in federal spending and balancing the budget, is this necessary or not? Mike, let's start with you.
Necessary. I mean, the question you should be asking is this completely misguided or not? And the answer is yes. I mean, over the course of the history of this country, we've practically never run a balanced budget. And the few times that we have preceded major economic collapses, like in the late 1920s and just recently. Look, in order to balance the budget of $1.3 trillion, the deficit, right, you have to remove $1.3 trillion from the private sector, from the private economy. Now, anyone who could argue that that's a good thing has got to be completely out of their mind. And in fact, we see them trying to do this in Europe, where the situation is a little bit different because all those countries over there, they're no longer currency issuers, but we see the outcome. The deficits are getting bigger, the economies are collapsing, unemployment is skyrocketing, you have social unrest everywhere you look. Look, the public's desire to save is what determines the size of the deficit. The only way that people can have dollars is if the government spends more dollars, then it confiscates from us in the form of taxes. That's the only way anyone could have a dollar in their pocket. So in order for the government to have balanced books, it has to remove those dollars from the private sector. Now, who's going to sit there and argue that draining $1.3 trillion in an economy that's already weak and where people are already lacking in income, that's a good thing? It's not, and that's precisely why we've never really seen this over the course of our history, and the times when we have seen it have preceded major economic collapses.
Well, let's get Karl's view on your take on history and the importance of balancing budgets. That is, that there isn't an importance in doing so. Karl?
Oh, I couldn't disagree more. Your other guest seems to have forgotten that in 1920 and 21, the federal government did exactly that, and the Federal Reserve raised interest rates. By the way, the person who counseled against this his last name was Hoover. I think you can figure out what he did after he was involved in commerce. What the government has done and what we've done since the 1950s is run about a 3% spread between debt accumulation in the economy and gross domestic product. And if you compound that over a working man's life, which is 45 years, what you do is this. You take an Obama bucks $3 bill here, and you get to keep, at the end of that, from your time as a worker, about 1/3 of it. The rest of it evaporates into the ether. And this is why what we're doing now doesn't work, because when you emit more credit into the system, you have, obviously, a larger GDP. But what I did was make the dollar worth less. And so you denominate something in what the other thing has been diminished, and you end up with a fraud. We say, well, it's 15 trillion in GDP, and it was 10 before. But what we're not talking about is that gasoline 4 years ago was half the price it is today. So why don't we deflate GDP by the price of gasoline or corn or any of these other commodities? Gee, we seem to be going backwards.
Well, we're not, because the GDP numbers all factor in. When you look at real GDP, there's growth in there as well. And if you really want to look at the purchasing power of the money, why don't you look at the amount of labor hours, because that's what we sell, right? We sell our labor to earn the dollars to purchase a car or a house or a movie theater ticket, all of which have gone up, and they always go up in a nominal, nominally they go up. But in terms of the amount of labor required to purchase that good or service, it's actually gone down. So the purchasing power has not been reduced. It has actually gone up. And there's many studies that show this. So you're completely wrong on that, Karl. I'm sorry.
Okay, let me let Karl respond, and then I want to move this forward. Karl, go ahead and respond to that. Mike says, hey, purchasing power has not declined.
Well, yeah, because the productivity of the American worker goes up. We started with picks and shovels and our hands, and then we went to animals, and then steam, and then mechanized farms, and automobiles and trucks and everything else. It's called productivity, it's called technology, and it inexorably advances. But what's being argued here is that the government has the right to steal that.
How is that stealing if you're creating more wealth?
And that's what's going on here. And so we should have dramatically higher standards of living than we have today. But instead, we're redistributing them and playing an arm-waving game to make it seem like it's all right.
Okay, let me move this conversation forward, because you guys both responded, but this is what I want to ask you, Mike. So $16 trillion in national debt, trillion-dollar deficits. Sure, the Fed can continue printing money unto infinity, but how do you address this issue that
we'll set that aside.
Okay, whatever.
Don't do that. The government,
lending money into existence.
It's an important point, because I hear you say this all the time.
Okay, Mike, hold on. This is my show, not yours. Let's answer my question, and then you can make your argument. But what I'd like to know is, how do you keep the dollar from being devalued when you are increasing the money supply, when you are putting more money into the system, and when you're running these huge deficits and all of this spending? How do you keep the dollar's value not from collapsing? Because remember, there's a foreign exchange market. How do you keep a blowout from happening in the foreign exchange market?
Well, Lauren, I think I've already addressed that, in the sense that the economy increases in size, so more goods and services are produced, so your real wealth increases. And by the way, if you want to just take a little litmus test or barometer of what the dollar has done since all this money printing by the Fed, as you call it, if you go back to 2008, when the Fed started to really engage in all these extraordinary activities with the fall of Lehman, and you look at the dollar index at that time, and you look at the dollar index now, and I use the dollar index because so many of these dollar bears, maybe you perhaps even, look at that and say, oh my God, it's crashing. It's actually up, okay? So how do you explain that? Because we printed 3 trillion, or the Fed has printed 3 trillion in reserves, and the dollar has gone up. And by the way, you could look at the same thing in Japan, you could look at the same thing in Europe, with massive so-called money printing by the central bank, and it has not had any effect on these currencies. What would have an effect on the currency is if the government just started printing money willy-nilly without the ability to expand the economy and have that flow into greater output, greater employment, greater production of goods and services. Then yes, you'd actually have the situation of too much money chasing too few goods. But you don't have that now. You have capacity sitting idle. You have millions of people unemployed. You have homes that are empty. You have factories that are running at 70% of their capacity. So, I mean, you have an enormous ability to continue to create wealth, to produce real goods and services. And we're worried about basically an accounting issue here, which is all that the dollar is. It's a keystroke on a keyboard.
Okay, I want to allow Karl to respond, but I do want to say there's an argument that there's a debt deflation going on. The question, though, is what happens when the deleveraging is done? What happens when interest rates do return to normal and you have these enormous interest payments? Not zero. They haven't been at zero. This is a historical low that we've seen since the financial crisis. My question is, when they return to a normal rate,
down, down, down. What's normal? Normal to you?
Okay, above zero. Above zero. And you could argue that any amount that they would go up above now would make a material difference to the amount that the U.S. government is paying in interest on the debt. So my question is, when they do rise, what happens to the amount of money the government is spending on interest payments, and how sustainable is that? Karl, I want to allow you to respond.
Yeah, let's just take a look at this from a standpoint of what's happened to the economy. We now have 4 years of running roughly 10% deficits, 12 to 8 in that general range. And what has actually occurred is that the median family income in nominal terms before inflation adjustments has gone down. So we have an argument here that we can print money, we can have, and that is what's going on. The government is issuing credit. The Federal Reserve is taking that credit up in the form of quantitative easing. That is what has been occurring. And what's really happening here is they are trying to fill the hole in bank balance sheets that the banks created by issuing unbacked credit for their derivative and other trading applications. And as a result, they're protecting the banks. None of it is going into the economy until this stops.
Right.
The problem with doing it is that the value of every dollar that's out there is being debased by this action. So you have real incomes decreasing in nominal terms, and then when you add the inflation adjustment to it, it's even worse.
Okay.
And Karl, here's your opportunity to respond and also to explain why I'm misguided when I say money printing.
Well, first of all, let me respond that the deficit of the government is equal to the savings, or the change in the size of the deficit is equal to the change in the savings of the non-government. That's how come, and you could look at this very graphically, it's very evident. When the government went from basically almost a balanced budget in early 2007 to a 1.5 trillion deficit, we saw private sector savings go from negative to a record nominal high of 700-something billion. Yes, the rest flowed out into the rest of the world because we run trade deficits, current account deficits. But how does Karl explain that? In his view of the world, that should have sucked savings away from the private sector. Yet what it did was add exactly the same amount to the penny, because if the government spends more, then it takes away from you in taxes. In other words, that's called a deficit. That money has to go somewhere, and it goes into the non-government, the private sector, and it balances out equally. The government's deficit is equal
before
to
we
the
go to break, I want to give Karl,
before
we get to the break, I want Karl to have a few seconds to respond to what you said, and we'll get to money printing later. Karl, you were shaking your head, and Mike was kind of hammering you. What do you have to say?
Yeah, this is just arm-waving nonsense, Lauren. This game has been played for the last 50 years.
Let Karl
and every time that this argument comes up, the bottom line is that they claim that there's such a thing as a free lunch. There is no such thing as a free lunch. When you emit credit into the economy, you dilute the value of every single dollar that's out there. GDP in nominal terms goes up because it must, but you haven't actually produced anything new.
It went up in real terms. It went up in real terms. I just said that, okay?
Hey, stop. Let Karl respond, Mike. Hold on. Okay.
Take the earplugs out of your ears.
You know what? Everybody put earplugs in your ears for a second and stop speaking, because we have to go to break. We're all warmed up. We're all warmed up. Hold on a moment.
We need to have some truth here.
Okay, we need to go to break. Mike Norman, we got to go to break. Mike, Karl, don't worry. We'll have plenty of time to respond. I got to hit a break. We'll be back in a couple minutes.